When the cargo plane touched down at Shanghai Pudong Airport in November 2020, it carried more than just seafood. Inside its refrigerated hold were Australian rock lobsters valued at $1.3 million, a shipment that would never reach Chinese dinner tables. Instead, those crustaceans became symbols of one of the most dramatic trade disputes of the modern era, frozen not by refrigeration, but by geopolitics. 4 years later, those shipments are moving again. In December of this year, Beijing made an announcement that sent waves of relief through fishing communities from Western Australia to Tasmania. Live Australian lobster imports would fully resume. It wasn't just about seafood. This decision marked the end of comprehensive trade restrictions that had strangled $12.4 billion worth of Australian exports, affecting everything from barley fields in rural Queensland to wine estates in the Adelaide Hills. For Australian fishermen who had watched their industry collapse, the news felt almost surreal. One veteran lobster catcher, speaking to reporters after the announcement, captured the mood perfectly. "We're already planning next year's operations," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To see the lobsters we've worked so hard to harvest finally returning to China, it feels like hope has been restored." But this story isn't simply about the revival of a trade relationship. It's about how economic interdependence collides with political ambition, how alliances are tested by market forces, and how a nation caught between two superpowers learned a costly lesson about the price of choosing sides. To understand where we are today, we need to rewind to a time when Australian products flowed freely into Chinese ports, when bilateral trade was booming, and when few could have predicted the economic warfare that was about to unfold. The Golden Era, when Australia and China were trade partners. Travel back with me to 2015. That year marked a milestone in economic cooperation between Canberra and Beijing. A comprehensive free trade agreement came into force, fundamentally reshaping commercial relationships between the two nations. Suddenly, Australian producers found themselves with unprecedented access to the world's most populous consumer market. Tariffs evaporated on product after product. Agricultural goods, livestock, energy resources, and mining products began flowing into China at volumes nobody had anticipated. The numbers told a story of growing dependence. Roughly 1/3 of everything Australia exported found its way to Chinese consumers and manufacturers. For many Australian industries, China wasn't just another customer, it was the customer. Consider Western Australia's lobster industry, the nation's primary source of rock lobster exports. Between 2018 and 2019 alone, this region shipped over 5,500 tons of premium lobster to China, generating more than 448 million Australian dollars in revenue. That's not just statistics on a spreadsheet. That's jobs, mortgages, school fees, and entire coastal communities sustained by Chinese demand. The peak of this commercial relationship came in 2019, when bilateral trade between the two nations reached an extraordinary $233.6 billion US dollars. To put that in perspective, this represented more than a quarter, 27.4%, of Australia's entire global trade portfolio. Japan, Australia's second-largest trading partner, didn't even come close at $131.9 billion. China had become the gravitational center of the Australian export economy. Walk through any port city in Australia during those years, and you'd see the evidence everywhere. Container ships bearing Chinese flags, warehouses stacked with products destined for Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. Wine producers expanding their vineyards specifically to meet Chinese tastes. Coal miners negotiating long-term supply contracts with Chinese energy companies. The relationship seemed unshakable, mutually beneficial, and destined to grow stronger. But beneath the surface, tectonic plates were shifting. The storm clouds gather. When politics invaded economics, the year 2020 changed everything. Not just because of the global pandemic that dominated headlines, but because of decisions made in Canberra that would reverberate through the Australian economy for years to come. The Morrison government, led by then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, was facing a strategic choice that nations caught between superpowers have confronted throughout history. Which side of the ledger matters more? Economic prosperity or strategic alliances? Morrison chose alliance over commerce. Washington had been courting Australia with increasing intensity, recognizing the nation's strategic position in the Asia-Pacific region and its abundant natural resources. Australia, for its part, saw an opportunity to elevate its status on the world stage by deepening its security relationship with the United States. The convergence of interests seemed perfect. What followed was a dramatic pivot toward Washington and an equally dramatic confrontation with Beijing. In April 2020, the Morrison government made headlines by calling for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, a move that Beijing perceived as hostile and aligned with American pressure tactics. But that was just the opening salvo. Morrison then announced something far more substantial: a massive $168 billion defense expansion over the coming decade, explicitly designed to support America's Indo-Pacific strategy, a framework widely understood to be aimed at containing Chinese influence in the region. From Beijing's perspective, Australia had crossed a line. The response came swiftly and systematically. In May 2020, Chinese authorities announced the first major restriction anti-dumping duties on Australian barley totaling an eye-watering 80.5%, a combination of 73.6% anti-dumping tariffs and an additional 6.9% countervailing duty over allegations of subsidization. The official justification was trade law compliance, but few observers missed the political message. The economic punishment had begun. What followed resembled a slow-motion collapse of Australia's China trade. Product categories fell like dominoes. Coal shipments, Australia's economic lifeblood, suddenly faced customs delays that turned into indefinite holds. Beef exporters found their licenses suspended. Timber shipments were rejected. Even iron ore, which China desperately needed for its construction industry, faced uncertain prospects. Then came that November day at Pudong Airport, when $1.3 million worth of live lobsters arrived in Shanghai, only to be turned away. The message couldn't have been clearer. If Australia wanted to align with America's strategic containment policies, it would pay a commercial price. The final hammer blow landed in March 2021, when Chinese regulators imposed devastating anti-dumping duties exceeding 200% on Australian wine. For an industry that had spent decades cultivating relationships with Chinese distributors and adapting products to Chinese consumer preferences, it was catastrophic. Overnight, one of Australia's most successful agricultural export sectors found itself locked out of its primary market. The restrictions would remain in place for 4 long years, during which Australian producers scrambled to find alternative buyers, workers lost jobs, and entire communities that had prospered from Chinese demand struggled to survive. The damage report, counting the cost of economic warfare. Let's talk about what these sanctions actually meant in human terms, because behind every statistic is a family, a business, a community. Take the lobster industry first. Before the ban, the numbers were staggering. 97.7% of Australia's rock lobster exports went to China. That's not a typo. Virtually the entire industry depended on a single market. Annual export volumes exceeded 1,600 tons, and the business model was simple and profitable. Fishermen caught premium lobsters. Chinese consumers paid premium prices. Everyone prospered. When the ban hit, that model disintegrated. Australian exporters spent the next 4 years desperately trying to redirect 90% of their product to alternative markets. The financial hemorrhaging was severe. Industry estimates suggest losses exceeding $500 million annually. But dry statistics don't capture what happened to fishing families who had invested their life savings in boats and equipment. One fisherman's testimony reveals the human cost. Lobsters that used to fetch 70 Australian dollars per kilogram suddenly dropped to $15 at the worst moments. Think about that collapse. A product losing more than 3/4 of its value doesn't just hurt profit margins, it destroys livelihoods. According to industry sources, approximately 50 fishing vessels were forced out of operation, displacing hundreds of workers from an industry that had sustained them for decades. Some found work elsewhere. Others left coastal communities altogether. Fishery managers describe the period in stark terms. For operators whose entire business model was built around lobster exports to China, it was an existential crisis. The coal industry suffered even more dramatic losses, though the impact was distributed across a larger sector. As one of Australia's 3 critical export commodities, alongside iron ore and natural gas, coal represented a fundamental pillar of the national economy. When Chinese ports suddenly stopped accepting Australian coal, the disruption was immediate and chaotic. Dozens of cargo ships found themselves in a nightmarish limbo, anchored off Chinese coasts with holds full of coal they couldn't unload. Some vessels waited for weeks, then months, burning through operating costs while their cargoes depreciated. The commercial losses were staggering, approximately $15 billion per year, according to industry calculations. That's equivalent to a significant fraction of Australia's GDP contribution from the mining sector essentially vanishing. Australian coal producers had no choice but to pivot aggressively toward alternative markets. Southeast Asian nations, particularly Vietnam and Thailand, absorbed some volume. India increased its purchases. But these replacement markets couldn't match Chinese demand in scale or pricing. Meanwhile, Beijing simply sourced its coal from Indonesia and Russia, demonstrating that in the modern global commodity trade, suppliers are often more replaceable than buyers. The wine industry's collapse was particularly painful because it represented years of careful market cultivation. Before the sanctions, Chinese consumers had developed a genuine appreciation for Australian wines, particularly premium labels from South Australia's renowned wine regions. China was importing nearly 40% of Australia's total wine exports, generating 1.24 billion Australian dollars in annual trade. When the 200% tariffs hit, that market evaporated virtually overnight. Wine producers watched helplessly as years of brand building and relationship development turned worthless. Vineyards that had expanded production specifically for Chinese demand suddenly had nowhere to sell their harvests. Some producers went bankrupt, others drastically scaled back operations. The smaller boutique wineries suffered disproportionately, while large producers could absorb losses and wait out the storm. Family-owned estates faced immediate existential threats. Economists who studied the sanctions calculated that Australia's agricultural export losses alone reached $6.2 billion in a single year. But the broader impact extended far beyond agriculture. Exports to China accounted for roughly 10% of Australia's entire GDP and supported approximately 10% of Australian jobs. The ripple effects touched everything from transportation and logistics to financial services and regional development. The turning point came not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet political transition. In May 2022, Australian voters made a choice that would reshape their nation's international relationships. They replaced the Morrison government with a Labour administration led by Anthony Albanese. The new Prime Minister brought a fundamentally different approach to China relations. Where Morrison had embraced confrontation, Albanese advocated engagement. Where his predecessor had echoed American talking points almost reflexively, the new government signaled it would pursue Australia's independent economic interests. Albanese made his position clear from the outset. Repairing the relationship with China wasn't a betrayal of Western alliances. It was economic necessity. The diplomatic offensive began immediately. Albanese and his foreign minister initiated a series of high-level meetings with Chinese counterparts, carefully navigating the complex task of rebuilding trust without appearing to abandon Australia's security commitments to Washington. The messaging was subtle but consistent. Australia could maintain its American alliance while simultaneously conducting normal commercial relations with China. Beijing watched, waited, and eventually began responding. The thaw happened gradually, restriction by restriction. In January 2023, China quietly lifted its ban on Australian coal imports. No grand announcement, no formal ceremony, just a bureaucratic notification that customs procedures would normalize. Australian coal ships began moving again through Chinese ports, and billions of dollars in trade resumed flowing. May brought the next concession. Timber imports from Australia were approved again. Then August delivered a major victory. The crippling barley tariffs were removed. Each step demonstrated that Beijing was willing to reward Australia's diplomatic pivot with concrete economic benefits. The pace accelerated in 2024. March saw the wine industry's resurrection when China eliminated the 200% tariffs that had devastated producers. By May, beef exporters started regaining access, with restrictions being lifted systematically from one processing facility after another. According to the Australian Meat Industry Association, only 2 slaughterhouses remained under restriction by late 2024, and negotiations to resolve those final barriers were progressing positively. Then came December's capstone announcement. Live Australian lobster imports would fully resume. For Canberra, this represented more than just another product category coming back online. It symbolized the complete removal of all trade sanctions that had been imposed 4 years earlier. Prime Minister Albanese's response captured both relief and satisfaction. Trade barriers worth approximately $12.4 billion that have constrained Australian exports have finally been dismantled. After 4 years of economic pain and diplomatic effort, the relationship had been restored. The rush to rebuild, Australia's response to renewed market access, really showed just how desperately industries had been waiting for this moment. Within just a few hours of China's lobster announcement, government officials and industry leaders were already mobilizing recovery plans that, honestly, had clearly been prepared well in advance. South Australia's governor, in particular, moved with impressive speed, unveiling a $30 million seafood export growth initiative designed specifically to capitalize on the reopened Chinese market. And the urgency made perfect sense. Before the ban, South Australian lobster exports to China generated $43 million each year and supported over 1,000 jobs. This was about more than just trade volumes. It was about restoring employment and economic vitality to coastal regions that had suffered through years of decline. Prime Minister Albanese, speaking to business leaders and the media, went beyond simply celebrating the end of restrictions. He projected real optimism about future growth, saying, "With Australian products like lobster and barley returning to the Chinese market, we anticipate trade volumes will not only recover but potentially exceed pre-restriction levels in certain categories." The subtext was clear. Australia had learned its lesson and was, eager to make up for lost time. Industry representatives echoed this enthusiasm, but there was also an undertone of caution, shaped by recent experience. They understood that rebuilding supply chains, re-establishing distributor relationships, and regaining consumer trust wouldn't happen instantly. Chinese importers had spent 4 years developing relationships with alternative suppliers from Canada, New Zealand, and elsewhere. So, Australian producers would need to compete to reclaim the market share they once dominated. Why China matters: the economics of dependence. To really understand why Australia pursued reconciliation so determinedly, we need to grasp the fundamental economic reality underlying this entire saga. For Australia, the Chinese market isn't optional, it's essential. Those 4 years of sanctions revealed a lot. When economists calculated the damage, the numbers were, frankly, sobering. Agricultural exporters alone lost $6.2 billion each year, just from products like barley. But the impact went far beyond agriculture. China accounted for roughly 10% of Australia's GDP through direct exports, and those exports supported about 10% of the nation's workforce. This is, quite literally, the definition of economic dependence. When a single trading partner accounts for that much of your economy, losing access to that market doesn't just hurt specific industries. It threatens national economic stability. The lobster industry is perhaps the clearest example. When 97.7% of your rock lobster exports go to one market, and that market suddenly closes, you don't have a fallback plan. You have a crisis. Australian lobster producers did find that alternative markets existed, but they just couldn't absorb anywhere near the same volume, and they certainly wouldn't pay the premium prices that Chinese consumers had been willing to spend. Similarly, coal producers learned that while Indonesia and Russia could supply China instead, finding replacement buyers for Australian coal at comparable prices and volumes was extremely difficult. Southeast Asian markets helped a bit, but they couldn't fully compensate for Chinese demand. The wine sector's experience was especially instructive. Australian winemakers had spent decades building brand recognition among Chinese consumers, adapting their products to local tastes, and establishing distribution networks across China. When the market closed, all that investment in market development essentially became worthless. Trying to replicate that success in alternative markets would take years and might never achieve the same scale. China's attraction for exporters goes beyond just its size. Although, sure, a market of 1.4 billion consumers certainly matters. What makes China particularly valuable is the expanding middle class, with disposable income and an appetite for premium imported products. Whether it's high-end seafood, quality wines, or premium beef, Chinese consumers have shown they're willing to pay top dollar for Australian products that are seen as safe, clean, and desirable. This combination, massive scale plus premium pricing, creates opportunities that simply don't exist in most other markets. For a relatively small exporting nation like Australia, with a population of just 26 million, access to China's consumer market is, honestly, an economic lifeline that's nearly impossible to replace. The broader pattern, Japan's similar struggle. Australia's experience isn't unique, and that makes the lessons here even more significant. Just look at Japan's current predicament, which follows a remarkably similar pattern and really demonstrates China's willingness to use market access as a geopolitical tool. In 2023, despite international protests and regional concerns, Japan proceeded with its controversial plan to release treated nuclear wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant into the Pacific Ocean. Over the course of 10 separate discharge events, approximately 78,300 tons of processed wastewater entered the sea. The Japanese government insisted the water had been treated to safe levels, and the International Atomic Energy Agency provided supporting assessments. But regional neighbors, especially China and South Korea, remained unconvinced. Beijing's response was swift and comprehensive. A complete ban on all aquatic products originating from Japan, implemented in August 2023. For Japan's fishing industry, the impact was devastating. China had been one of the largest markets for Japanese seafood, and losing that access meant finding alternative buyers for everything from scallops to sea cucumber. Now, more than a year later, Japan is taking steps that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Tokyo has agreed to allow Chinese experts direct access to the Fukushima discharge site for independent sampling and monitoring. This represents a significant concession. Previously, Japan had refused similar requests from Russia, South Korea, China, and other nations, insisting that only domestic companies could conduct water quality testing. So, what changed? The same economic reality that drove Australia's diplomatic pivot. Japan's aquaculture industry, like Australia's lobster fishermen, discovered that alternative markets exist, but just can't replace Chinese demand at a comparable scale and pricing. Even for the world's fourth largest economy, losing access to China's market creates pressures that eventually force policy adjustments. China has indicated a willingness to lift the seafood ban, but with a clear precondition. Japan must cease discharging nuclear wastewater into the ocean. Whether Tokyo will ultimately accept that condition remains to be seen, but the fact that negotiations are happening at all demonstrates the magnetic pull of Chinese market access. The geopolitical lesson: markets as weapons. If we step back from the specific stories of lobsters and wine, coal and barley, a larger pattern really starts to emerge, one with implications that go far beyond Australia or Japan. What we're witnessing here is the weaponization of market access in the service of geopolitical objectives. China's approach to Australia reveals a pretty sophisticated strategy. Rather than imposing broad, headline-grabbing sanctions, Beijing targeted specific sectors for maximum political impact, while minimizing damage to its own economy. The products chosen weren't random. They struck at regionally concentrated industries where the pain would be felt acutely in particular communities and electoral districts: wine country in South Australia, lobster fishing communities in Western Australia, barley farmers in Queensland. These weren't just economic targets, they were political pressure points. At the same time, China carefully avoided sanctioning products it couldn't easily replace. Iron ore, which China needs in massive quantities for its construction and manufacturing sectors, largely continued flowing despite tensions. Why? Because China lacks comparable alternative suppliers at the necessary scale. This really shows the limits of economic coercion. It works best when the party imposing restrictions has alternatives available. For middle powers like Australia, the situation creates an almost impossible dilemma. Security concerns and strategic alliances pull in one direction, especially when a superpower like the United States offers protection and partnership. But economic interests pull in another direction, toward the massive consumer market that China represents.